So hello everyone, my name is Shannon. I'm one of the naturalists up at the Woodlands Nature Station. Have any of you guys been there before?
Yes.
Seeing, looks like most of you, almost every hand went up right there. Most of you are familiar with what we are at the Nature Station. We have a small nature center there out in the middle of Lamington Lakes National Recreation Area, over 45 species of rescued native wildlife. We also have native gardens. So our goal is for people to be able to see the wildlife of Kentucky and Tennessee. Sometimes that might be something big like a white-tailed deer or a coyote or a bobcat, but we also want to make sure people get a chance to look at some of the smaller things, like the bees, the butterflies that are going to be in our native gardens. So today I'm going to do kind of an overview of all the different pollinators that you might see, as well as kind of have some tips and tricks for attracting them to your yard. The second half of the program, I'm going to more concentrate just on native gardening and give some recommendations for getting started or maintaining a native garden, as well as some plants that I would recommend. Now, this program here, I do want to thank the Tennessee Valley Authority. They funded a series of pollinator outreaches for us just to help to teach people a little bit more and to create more habitat in their own backyards. Okay, so pollinators and their flowers. There's so many different flower shapes out there, and they really all do match up to a specific type of pollinator. So you can see, a few different ones here. I'm sure some of you can right away identify who would go to some of these flowers here. Long tubular, hummingbird. Hummingbird is one right there. But then there's some like the flowers of the tulip tree. Who pollinates those? So hopefully I'll answer some of those questions as we go through. What we're going to do is look at broad groups of pollinators and then talk about some of their requirements for their habitat. Now, as I go through, if you guys have questions, please raise your hand and let me know. Okay, now usually the first pollinator people think of is bees. And 9 times out of 10, they're thinking of the honeybee. Now, honeybees are actually non-native. So they were brought over from Europe, and they're found in the wild. There's colonies out in the wild quite frequently. They don't have to be kept by a beekeeper. They kind of go feral here and there. But they are a non-native species. And a lot of our plants that are native to this area are going to do better with native bees. Now, for one thing, native bees are a lot more hardworking. They're going to be out earlier in the season. They'll be out when it's colder. They'll stay out later. They'll just do a little bit more work. A great illustration of that is a single mason bee can pollinate about 12 pounds of cherries. It takes 60 honeybees to do the same amount of work as that single mason bee. They have done studies and they found that farm fields that actually have an area nearby that's fallow that allows for native pollinators to thrive have greater yields than ones that do not have those fallow areas because our native bees are just doing so much work. So honeybees, they are important for, worldwide for our crops and everything, but the native bees do a lot of work for us as well. And there's also some crops that are native to the Americas. They have to have native bees. A great example of that would be something like a tomato. A honeybee cannot pollinate a tomato because it requires something called buzz pollination. So a bee that's great at buzz pollination is a bumblebee. If you've ever seen them, if you have tomato plants, they grab a hold of the flower and they just shake it. So you need a bee that's a little bigger, a little stronger to effectively pollinate things that need buzz pollination. So we do need our native bees. Now, there is no way I could really cover native bees in depth in this program. There are over 4,000 species of native bees here in the Americas. So there's a lot of variation. There's big ones, there's small ones. There are long-tongued bees, short-tongued bees. Now, all of them are going to have different preferences and requirements for flowers. By and large, I really think if you're a gardener like me and you start gardening, you're like, oh, I want that plant and that one and that one and that one. You're probably going to just naturally be doing well for the native bees because every plant's going to have a certain group of bees that they might be a little bit better towards. So having a little bit of variety is a great way to go. So I'm going to have a few slides that are like this. These are only pictures that I took at the nature station, so in our native gardens. There's a lot of variety of bees out there, but just the ones found right here in Kentucky can be pretty impressive. Now you will notice at the top I included a wasp. They can be pretty. Maybe I'll convince you of that, maybe not. But I sometimes get asked by people, how can I encourage the bees but get rid of the wasps? You really can't. They are going to be using the same habitat. Wasps aren't quite as good at pollination as our bees, mostly because you can really see in the body shape, they don't have as many hairs on them. So with our bees, all the little hairs on their bodies help to carry the pollen from flower to flower, but the wasps do some pollination. And by and large, the species that you're going to encounter at your flowers, they're just going from flower to flower looking for nectar and pollen. They're really not worried about you. I was really excited to find the American bumblebee. That is an endangered species. So we do have endangered bees and bumblebees. So having native gardens is a way to really help the environment. And then of course, like the sweat bees, they're just one of my favorites. Those metallic colors, I mean, you just don't see that color in nature very often. And then a few other ones around here as well. Like I said, all of those were found at the Nature Station Gardens.
Is there a place we could get, for instance, a card or a paper that had pictures of all the bees, or not all, but a lot of the local bees that we have?
That's a great question. I know of some like posters and flyers that have been made that have bumblebees of the eastern United States. That's still not super local, it's a big area. You might also be able to find things if you go to the Xerces Society website. I also have that in the handout right here. They have a lot of information on native bees, so they might be one to start with for that. There is a book I've been meaning to buy that's about this thick on identifying bumblebees. So there are a lot of publications out there, but I think it's just a really cool thing.
Thank you.
Okay, now some of your bees are going to be going to pretty much every flower. Some of them are a little bit more specialized. Now I love to show this picture because one of the top questions I get is, what good are carpenter bees? So carpenter bees, if you have encountered them, they are going to drill into basically any unpainted, unstained wood they find. Now each female is going to have her own hole. That is where she is laying her eggs. So she's going to drill into there, lay her eggs. She will chase other bugs, sometimes people, away from that location. She's trying to protect it. So of course that can cause damage. It can definitely frustrate people. So they always ask me, what good are they? And if you ever see a carpenter bee on a purple passion flower, you really see where they fit into the ecosystem. So have you guys seen purple passion flowers? See, most heads nod. It is a native species. You can find it sometimes out in the prairies. A lot of people like to have it in their garden because it's just beautiful. I mean, it looks super tropical, yet it's native to Kentucky. But you can see where they have their pistils and their stamens are held relatively high above the flower itself. So it takes a pretty large bee to be able to go in and have that hit it on the back to transport the pollen. And our carpenter bees are really our biggest bee that we have around here. For the most part, I think it's the biggest one you're gonna see. So you can take a look at this picture right here. You can see all of those pollen grains covering that bee right there. So this beautiful flower does need bees like the carpenter bee in order to continue. So everything has a purpose. Some things can be a little bit annoying. When people ask me for advice on controlling the carpenter bees, it's usually just stain or paint wood that you don't want them to drill into because they're pretty tenacious. They will find something. I once had a shovel. I leaned it against the house, went in for the night, came back out, and one had drilled almost all the way through it. Now the shovel's not big enough to drill a whole chamber for laying their eggs, so they gave up after a point, but they tried.
Now you have a way to hang up your shovel.
Yeah. Maybe, yeah, they helped me out.
So how do they drill?
So they are basically chewing their way into it, yeah. They're ones where they're not likely, they're really not going to sting you if you grab a hold of them or something. They can bite. Mm-hmm. And that does kind of lead us into nesting sites. So when we think about, bees and pollinators, we often think about the food they need, but they're also going to need shelter, a place to make a home. Now this is going to vary depending on the kind of bee it is. So those carpenter bees, they make their own holes. They drill right in there. But there are a lot of things like mason bees and such, which are going to look for an already existing cavity. So they will go into that, they carry little bits of mud and create a cell, and then they're going to pack that full of pollen and lay a single egg. Seal it off, do the same thing in the next chamber, over and over again. And then those babies are going to hatch out, they'll eat their pollen, they'll go through that larval stage, then they're going to go into the pupa, and then later they will emerge as adults. So having sites like that are going to allow them to nest is going to increase your number of pollinators.
What bee is that?
Things like mason bees. Yeah, there's a whole variety of ones that will use that. Mason bees are one. We also sometimes see like leafcutter bees, which will go through our garden. Basically, they do it real similar, except they will help wall off the chambers with bits of leaves. I actually have one plant that I let grow in the garden. It's a tick seed, which means after it flowers, it does have really pretty flowers. They're small, bright pink, but then it makes those tiny little stick tights, which any of the staff that go through and weed, they will come by and they'll be picking them off themselves. But if you pick one of those leaves, it's going to be covered in all these little half circle cutouts. Because for some reason, the texture, the size of that leaf, the leafcutter bees love it. And so they will use that to create their nests. Now, you can buy different bee houses. Now, with them, you do want to do things like clean them out year to year, because with any place where you have an animal that goes year after year after year, things like diseases and parasites can build up. Now this one right here was an Eagle Scout project. He made us, I think it was 7 different bee boxes. We put them up, and like a week later I was seeing bees coming in and out of them. It was really cool. This one is a little bit different in that it has a door. So even having little areas here and there in your yard or garden that you leave bare, so that things like bumblebees can nest in the ground, is going to also increase your number of pollinators. Now another great way is after the fall, when everything starts to die back, at the nature station, we don't cut down all of those old twigs. We let them stay up into the spring. Once things start growing again, that's when we'll start to trim it up. And that's because a lot of things are going to overwinter in those stems. So bees may use them to nest, and you might get stuff, even things like butterflies and things that are going to overwinter in those clumps of grass, in those old dried stems. Okay, and that kind of does lead me to our next set of pollinators. Lepidoptera, the butterflies. I do think these are probably one of the most popular pollinators for people to talk about. Now I included both moths and butterflies with it, so they're all under that grouping of Lepidoptera. Right here is a hawk moth. These guys are about this big. They're really big, cool looking. They often have some bright pink markings. So even though they're out at night, we don't see them as much, they can be just as beautiful as those butterflies. Now, butterflies are going to be looking for an assortment of different flowers. They typically like fairly large patches of flowers. They're very visual. As they're flying around, they need to see that there's enough flowers down there for it to be worth them to come down and land. And when they do go to feed on the nectar, they're typically going to land on top of the flower. So things that looks like they could land and just stand on are going to be good butterfly flowers. Bright colors are going to attract them. Now it may seem that this middle one is white, but white can be pretty bright, particularly in a slightly shaded forest where the buttonbush typically grows. So things are bright, attract them. They often like single big flowers they can go to, or large clusters of small flowers. They want to make it worth their while when they do land. Now moths, it's pretty similar, but they're gonna really like things that are white, bloom at night, and have a strong fragrance. That's gonna be one of the main ways that they find their flowers. So the flowers I chose to highlight right here, this one is called butterfly milkweed. So it tells you in its name that it is good for the butterflies. And it's a nice, beautiful, bright orange color. This one likes really sunny, dry spots. Then you have the buttonbush. That is a shrub. It's gonna do well in shady areas, which is often a really hard one to get flowers into. They can tolerate more sun, but if they're in a sunny spot, they're gonna wanna have their feet wet. They're gonna wanna be growing in water. In the wild, you'll typically find them along the edges of ponds. And along the edges of ponds, they're constantly being pruned down by beavers. So they're ones that are very easy for pruning. If you decide it's too big, you can just kind of hack it down. It'll re-sprout from there. But it makes those large globed flowers. I've seen a single flower like that with about 5 tiger swallowtail butterflies all trying to hang on to it at the same time. So really popular. And then the last one right here is purple coneflower. That's another good one for butterflies, but honestly, really any coneflower, any kind of big, flat, open daisy-like flower they do seem to like. So there's a fair variety there to choose from. Okay, now when we are offering them flowers for nectar, we also want to consider what their babies need. So butterflies are going to have some different host plants. Some species of butterflies will lay their eggs on pretty much anything, but other ones are more specialized. One specialist is the zebra swallowtail. These guys are going to lay their egg on pawpaw. So pawpaw is a really fun plant to have. It does have small red flowers in the spring, but usually that's not what really attracts people to the plant. They're usually, if they want to have it in their yard, they usually want it because it is the largest fruit native to North America. Anyone here ever eaten pawpaw? Seeing a few hands go up there. I used to be able to eat pawpaw, and then I started to develop an intolerance to it. So it tastes really good. If you can eat it, it's definitely worthwhile. But largest fruit native to North America, and then these guys are going to land on the leaves, lay their eggs, and then those caterpillars are going to eat those leaves right there. Another great example is, of course, monarchs and milkweed. They're another specialist. They only lay their eggs on milkweeds. So if you do want to help out the monarch butterfly, you want to make sure you have their larval host plant. Now, when it comes to milkweeds, there are many different varieties out there. And I do recommend for people to go with native milkweeds. Basically, the level of different chemicals and everything in the plant are going to be what the butterflies from this area are adapted to. Tropical milkweed is one that is from further south. I think it's originally from maybe Central America, South America, but we do see a lot of people planting it. Now that can be a bit of an issue. Monarchs do have a disease called, I can't pronounce it, I'm going to say OE parasite. It's got a really long name right there. It's a protozoan parasite. And the different chemicals in the milkweed do help them to fight it off. But if they don't have the right levels, they're not going to be as good at fighting it off. And then because tropical milkweed doesn't necessarily die back in the same way as our native milkweeds, it can actually carry that parasite on it for longer periods of time. So it's definitely recommended to go with native milkweeds when you can. And if you look here, there's a lot of native milkweeds to choose from. There is common milkweed, which is one of my favorites. Some people don't like it as much because it does kind of walk all around your flower garden. It doesn't stay put, but if you have a wild area that you can let the plants just kind of go where they want, it's a great choice. It's a good one for butterflies, also for bees, also for hummingbirds. Everyone likes that plant. Another one is red ring milkweed. So these ones actually have white blooms and they do tolerate some shade, which all these other milkweeds want to have full sun. So red ring does tolerate shade. Butterfly milkweed we covered already, just a really pretty bright orange right there. Swamp milkweed is a great one if you do want to or need to have a slightly more maintained garden look, because they're going to grow in the same clump year after year. The clump will get a little bit bigger, but they're not going to suddenly pop up 5 feet away the way the common milkweed will. And those ones, by the name swamp milkweed, they can grow in a wet area, but they can also grow in just regular garden soil. And then spider milkweed, it comes in green as well, and that's another one that is going to like kind of like a hot, dry area, but it's a little bit shorter than some of the other milkweeds. It's 1 to 2 feet tall, so it might be better for certain areas because it doesn't get, common milkweed can get 4 or 5 feet tall sometimes. So lots of flowers, but a little bit more height. Okay, so I mentioned that the pawpaw had little red flowers. That is what they look like. Now, I doubt any of you are going to leave here saying I'm going to plant more flowers to try to attract flies, but they are a very important pollinator. So we definitely want to think about them when we're thinking about that whole ecosystem. So sometimes people might see flies and stuff around and just be like, oh, I don't want them near my plants. They're also pollinating things. And there are a number of flowers that specialize in having flies be their pollinators. Typically, if that flower is a really dull brick red color, if it has a slightly bad smell to it, it's probably trying to get flies nearby. With the pawpaw, early settlers would actually hang rotten meat in their pawpaw trees in order to get more flies to the area to increase the number of pawpaw flowers that got pollinated. Then you have jack-in-the-pulpit, beautiful, cool plant. It's got, some neat foliage, that neat jack-in-the-pulpit flower right there, another fly-pollinated one, and then even our beautiful trilliums. They are also pollinated by flies. And then pipevine. Now, pipevine is the host plant for our pipevine swallowtail, and it is also pollinated by flies. So their butterflies are going to it, so their caterpillars can eat the leaves, but their flowers do need flies to pollinate them. And they're a really interesting one. Basically, there's little hairs inside of the flower, so the flies can go in, but they can't go out. And until a fly goes in with pollen, the hairs don't relax. So basically, it traps the flies in there until it gets pollinated, and then they can escape. So it has its own unique method right there, but fly pollinated. Now, I do have another pictures of different flies that I caught pollinating our flowers at the nature station. So you can see there's a lot of variety there. There's ones called flower flies, of course. Some of them do look just like bees. And until you take a closer look, you might not realize that it's actually a fly. But even some of the, less pretty, more common looking flies, they're still there pollinating our flowers. And then this guy, the swift feather-legged fly, he's actually sometimes used for biological control of crop pests. So they're doing a lot of work out there. So those guys will lay their eggs on things like green stink bugs that might eat our fruit and plants. So they're helping to control it. So they're doing a little bit of pollination, helping to control pests right there. So it's really all interconnected. So having a lot of everything is really one of the best things for your backyard habitat. Okay, now the next one is another pollinator that I doubt you guys are going to be looking to get, but they're a really important one. Beetles. So beetles are also doing a lot of pollination. They're actually one of the earliest pollinators. So the oldest plant types, they were pollinated by beetles. So things like the magnolia tree, the tulip popular, which is in the magnolia family, it has that kind of cup-shaped flower right there. And then things like the spice bush do rely on beetles in order for pollination to occur. Now, beetles aren't always the tidiest pollinators, so sometimes you might see them in the flowers and be like, oh, they're making a mess of it, but that's just what they have been doing for thousands of years. So they will basically go and kind of live in the flower for a while, and then move on to the next flower. And they're going to help to transport the pollen in that way. Okay, So like I said, I hope that you will at least appreciate things like the beetles and the flies in your gardens, even if you're not going to actively try to get them there. Just be like, okay, you're part of my ecosystem. But we're going to move on to the next pollinator that I bet you'll all be excited to see. Ruby-throated hummingbird. So one of the things that most people are actively trying to get more of into their yard. They want to see more of them. Now, just like with everything else, you want to provide all that they need there. Food, water, shelter, safety, not just the flowering plants. Now, with water, there's a variety of things you can do there. You can have bird baths with maybe rocks in them with very, very shallow areas because hummingbirds are tiny. Also, things like drip hoses, they will really enjoy. And if you ever set up a sprinkler, you'll probably see your hummingbirds flying through it. They like to take showers there. Now, shelter is basically bushes, trees, places for them to go sit and hide. So if you have a big open yard and then just a few flowers here and there, the hummingbirds might see the flowers, but it seems pretty dangerous to fly out to them. So they'll be less likely to come. We have found that our feeders that are right next to a bush get visited way more often than all of the other feeders. So just having a place for them to kind of fly into, to hide, to come back out is really beneficial. And then, of course, food. Now, we all know what hummingbirds eat. Flowers. They are going to go for the nectar to drink from, and they like long tubular flowers in bright reds and oranges. And you can really see, you know, these flowers, they're designed with the hummingbird in mind. But bugs and insects, those are also a vital part of their food. A hummingbird can eat about 2,000 bugs a day. They need to have some protein. They are going to be raising their young, and the young can't get bigger just on nectar alone. So having a lot of flies and beetles and spiders is going to make it easier for them to raise their young, which is going to increase the number of hummingbirds that you are going to be able to see and enjoy in your yard. Now, one thing when you are watching your hummingbirds, a rule of thumb is take however many you see at once and multiply it by 5. That's about how many you actually have in the area, because you'll never see every single hummingbird at the same time. So if you do that, multiply it by 5, you'll have a good idea of how many are actually coming to your yard. Okay, so at this point, we're going to get a little bit more into native gardening in general. So when we're looking at natives, it's kind of a question of which one is or isn't native. So pretty much if it's here before 1492, it's considered native. Now, we do have some non-natives that you can find around that don't really impact the ecosystem in any way. You can consider those naturalized. And then invasives are ones that actively compete and cause harm to the ecosystem. So I definitely would encourage people to see what is invasive in your area and go for a different alternative right there. Okay, so with natives, they are more attractive to wildlife. They often tolerate poor soil and less water compared to a lot of our traditional garden plants. They're more resistant to the diseases that are found in this area because they are native to this area. They'll typically come back year after year, and that means that in general, they're less costly to maintain. Now, on the other side of it, they can be a bit more expensive when you're buying the original plant, buying the first plant right there. And it might be harder to find some of those natives because a lot of our typical nurseries you go to and you're going to see a whole bunch of zinnias and marigolds and other things, but you're not necessarily going to find something like Indian pink, which is a great hummingbird plant that is native to Kentucky. And then they do take a little bit of time to establish. We'll often talk about how the natives are great with poor soil and less water, but you want to make sure they get the time to establish their roots before you kind of go back on the care for them. Now, when you are looking for the different pollinator plants, there's a few things to keep in mind. One is, what is the source? Are you getting them that are from a local area? Some things are found, like milkweed, you can find all across North America. So is it milkweed that's from Kentucky, Tennessee, this general area, or is it some that's, from up in Minnesota? Because those ones, of course, are going to have, hundreds, thousands of years of different growing conditions compared to the ones here in Kentucky. So getting that local phenotype is going to give you more success. Also knowing if the place you're buying it from, how did they get them? You definitely don't want to get them where they're like digging them up from the wild or something. So just kind of finding out where those plants are coming from. Does the nursery use pesticides on them? You could be doing a native garden, no pesticides because you don't want to hurt the bees, and then buy some plants from a nursery and they could have been treated with pesticides and you've basically just brought that into your yard. So you'll definitely want to look into that as well. And then, is it actually a wild one? So columbines are a great example because they are wild, but people really like columbines, and so they've grown all types of different cultivars. So right there, those are both columbines. Now the one at the bottom, they have bred it to increase the number of petals. It has lost its color right there. It's now a white one. If you were a hummingbird, would you be as interested in that particular flower? Yeah, it doesn't have that bright color that attracts the hummingbird to it. It has so many petals, it might be harder for the pollinator to actually get in there and get the nectar. And when they're breeding them like that for looks, they're not necessarily trying to make sure that it still has a lot of nectar available. So it's not necessarily going to be quite as beneficial to our native pollinators when it is a cultivar. Okay, and then this one, I try to tell myself this every day as I try to maintain the native gardens at the nature station. And I go in and I find that some animal has eaten another bit of some plant. So plant damage is natural. It's what we want to see because all of these organisms are utilizing that habitat that you have created. And sometimes that means they are eating the leaves. They are causing damage to it. But all that means is it's working how it's supposed to work. Your ecosystem is thriving. So for example, those little caterpillars and worms and such that are causing damage to your leaves, they are going to be attracting in all kinds of birds. So bluebirds are going to want to eat bugs. They're insectivores. They're looking for little bugs to eat. Different warblers, as I said, the hummingbirds, they really need to have bugs, that protein. Scarlet tanager, prothonotary warbler, indigo bunting. So all these beautiful birds we love to see, they really can't exist without bugs to eat. And then of course, some of them are going to grow up to be those beautiful butterflies. I had several times people would come in and complain about there were caterpillars all over a variety of plants, and then it'd be like, what plant is it? Like, oh, those are swallowtail butterflies. They're going to be butterflies later. And that completely changed people's perception of them, knowing that they would grow up to be pretty. But all of them, whether they grow up into a butterfly or not, are part of that food chain, that food web, so they are going to be contributing to your overall garden ecosystem. Now, another thing that I always like to encourage people to consider are plants that we kind of consider weeds. Now, we as humans might not like them for one reason or another, but a lot of these are really, really good for our native pollinators. Now, American germander is the one at the top right there with those little white flowers. It will grow about everywhere. We kept having it pop up in one of our gardens, and so we would weed it out. It would come up again. It was really tenacious. And so one year we were like, let's just let it have this section right here and see what happens. We had hummingbirds coming to it, bees coming to it. Everything seemed to love the plant. So even though it might not be what you had in mind for that particular area, if a native plant is doing really well there, it's sometimes worth just seeing, okay, who's going to come visit here? You know, you want to be part of this ecosystem, you're growing well, why fight it? Another one, jewelweed. Jewelweed is one where the plants do get pretty tall. They can look weedy. They're not like these neat, compact plants. But when you get to the fall, they have those bright orange flowers on them. They're really pretty flowers. And they're super popular with hummingbirds. So we have at the nature station, our upper yard is where we have all of the hummingbird feeders. In the end of summer, we have about 250 hummingbirds a day up there. So you can kind of go in the yard, they're all zipping and zooming all around you. Then if you go down the hill to our wolf pond, so down by our wolf pen, we have this natural pond right there. Jewelweed likes to grow in wet areas. It's growing all around the outside. The hummingbirds are just as active down there. So just by this one native plant. So it's a great one to consider if you do have like a wet ditch or something. If you can get some jewelweed in there, it'll make the ditch a little bit prettier in the fall. You'll have those nice flowers, and it's a great hummingbird plant. Now, a fun fact about it, if you're into natural dyes, those green plants make orange dye. And then common milkweed right here. That one I mentioned a little bit beforehand, but if you were going to have just one native plant in your yard, I do think milkweeds are a great way to go, and common milkweed is a really nice one. Like I said, it's not the neatest plant, and it might not stay in the same place in your garden. It's going to send runners and pop up in new spots, but the bees, the butterflies, the hummingbirds, everyone really likes it. And it is one where as you walk by, it's this really heavy perfumey smell. So people will always step out of our back doors and they'll be like, what flower is that? And then some of them you tell them it's the milkweed and they'll be like, that's a weed. Weeds can be pretty, they really can. And then goldenrod. If you were looking at one plant for our native bees, I might point you in the direction of a goldenrod. Now, goldenrod does kind of get a bad rap. How many people have believed that goldenrod have caused allergies? Seeing a hand go up here and there. I'm sure you guys have heard it at some point. They'll be like, those yellow plants are blooming. My nose is stuffed up. They're causing my allergies. Now, goldenrod is an insect-pollinated plant. So what that means is those pollen grains are kind of heavy and sticky so they can stick to the insect. They're not flying around through the air. Now, with that said, if you stick your nose in the goldenrod and smell, maybe it might cause an allergic reaction in some people. But if you're not near it, it's not reaching you. The pollen is not getting into your nose. At the same time that goldenrod is blooming, ragweed is blooming. Ragweed is small, the flowers are green, nobody notices them, but they're wind pollinated. So it is just blowing through the air, we're seeing the goldenrod, we're breathing in the ragweed, and we get our allergies. Now, goldenrod is a late fall bloomer, and a lot of bees really rely on that to get them through the winter. They're going to be collecting nectar, collecting pollen to be able to get through the winter and make it to spring. And if you ever do smell goldenrod flowers, they smell just like honey. A lot of the honey we consume probably has some goldenrod nectar and pollen in it. Okay. So right here I have some different tips. Now I did cover a fair amount of it as I went through there, but adapting to your site is something I strongly encourage. It can be really easy to see different cool plants and want to plant them in your yard, but you'll definitely want to consider, does the soil you have support them? Do they get enough sun? Is it really an appropriate plant for this location? Embracing opportunistic natives. See what's already growing in your area. Sometimes you can be surprised by how many things will pop up, and some of them have some really beautiful flowers. Of course, you want to avoid pesticides and herbicides if you are trying to get more insects. Pesticides do not discriminate, so they're going to kill everything, not just one particular species there. And then leaving the stems standing over the winter is really going to help you out in order to provide little refuge, little habitats for them to get through the winter. So everything from butterflies to bees are going to be in those dead plants there.
I have a question. A lot of plants that you have, it's suggested that you cut them back like in the late fall if they're an early spring bloomer so that they will rebloom. And then if they bloom later, you cut them back like February or something. Can you still leave those up and will they come back?
I've been able to. Is there a certain plant you're thinking of?
No, just in general. I mean, some of the classes I've taken, they
Okay.
do that.
I'll be honest, for every single plant at the nature station, I don't cut down the dead stems until the next spring. And
Even if they're a spring bloomer?
Even if they're a spring bloomer. So typically the new plant might start to grow up next to it, but it's at that point the dead stem is just the dead stem kind of growing where the old growth was, and then the rootstock is going to send up the new leaves and everything. Yeah, I can't speak to every single plant out there. There might be some that have more specific requirements, but there's not a single plant at the nature station that I don't wait until the next spring to cut back.
Okay, that's good. Thank you.
Okay. So that does bring us towards the end of it. I do want to show you guys a few different resources. Now, I do have a handout right here that has some of my recommended resources. I tried to make it a short list because it can be kind of overwhelming to get a lot here, but I've got it broken up by books, websites, and nurseries. So I have 4 different nurseries in the area that do sell native plants. All of them we have used at the nature station. There's also a brochure here that's about native plants and hummingbird gardening right here. And then just a few things. So I already kind of mentioned Xerces Society. They have a lot of information on their website. There are a lot of PDFs you can download. You can basically go to an area, type in what state you're in, and they'll give you information that's pertinent to just that area. So it does help to kind of narrow down all of the information out there to something that works for just here. And then another great resource is if anyone has read any books by Douglas Ptolemy. So he does a lot of information on talking about how to make our backyards more hospitable to wildlife. Now, his #1 tip is oak trees. I didn't go into detail about oak trees right here. They're not necessarily something we're thinking about for pollinators, but they support over 300 species of butterflies and moths. So if you want something that's going to help feed the birds, if you want to have more butterflies and moths, our native oaks are going to provide a lot of benefit to our yards as well. Okay, now at this point, I do want to thank all of you for coming. I also want to thank the Tennessee Valley Authority for funding our outreaches right here. And do you guys have any questions? Yes?
I have a volunteer tree, mulberry.
Okay.
Is that a good one? I know it provides food for the birds and everything.
So there are native and non-native mulberries around. Yeah, I might recommend kind of trying to find out if it's a native or not. Something you can do is, get pictures of it, maybe talk to your extension office. There's also an app called iNaturalist where you can make sightings of the things you find and post it, and then people will, okay, so that might be an option you can go on there as well. And then I think it's really also a personal choice. Like, do you like the mulberry tree in the area? It is providing food for the birds. So, yep. Now, yep. When you can beat the birds there. So I've been talking a lot about, different native plants. But a lot of people will ask me like, well, what if I like this plant that's not native? My recommendation is maybe try to avoid the invasive plants, the things that are going to cause an issue, but it's not always realistic for everyone's yards to be 100% native. That's a wonderful goal to aspire to. My yard is not native. I've got a whole big area of natives, and I do have just some plants I enjoy. There were daffodils already in my yard when I bought it, and I'm like, they're pretty. I'm just gonna leave them behind for now. So it's definitely, you kind of have to look at your yard and your situation and decide what you want to have there. Okay, well, thank you guys so much for coming. I'll hang out here a little bit if you have any other questions or want to grab any resources right now. But on behalf of the Woodlands Nature Station, the Tennessee Valley Association, I would like to thank you guys for coming out and learning more about pollinators. Thank you.